What's happening, everybody? How we doing? Happy Thursday to you. A little background intro music happening here on the live. It's actually a stock song that comes with the Rodecaster one. I hope it's not copyrighted because Facebook will throw me off. Anyway, what's happening, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Podcasts Suck. If you don't have one, I want to talk to you today about how to make money with a podcast. I talk about this frequently in the talks that I get the opportunity to give. And through the content that I create, I firmly believe there are two reasons, why you should start a podcast. Number one, it's to meet people that you want to do business with. That's what we're going to talk about today. And then secondly, you record one podcast episode and you repurpose that content into several pieces of content. I'm talking clips for reels, blog posts, images, video content, repurposing it into any type of content that you currently create or want to create for your brand. It's possible with your podcast. So if it's your first time tuning into the show, we stream this show live as we record it on Facebook, LinkedIn, and on YouTube. So if you're tuning in on those channels, a big hello and thanks for taking some time out of your day to hang out with me for just a few minutes so I can help you better understand what you don't know about the world of podcasting. I hope you're leaving this episode with exactly what you came for, which is something that you don't know. Now, if you're returning, thanks so much for taking some time to hang out with us once again on the show. If you enjoy the show, tell people about it. It's how people find the show, learn more about it, and most importantly, learn how to start a podcast the right way. All right, let's dive into this. So, how to make money with a podcast. Imagine being able to interview anyone that you want to network with, do business with, prospect, whatever you want to call it, whatever your day looks like, whatever your job looks like, whatever your responsibilities are on a daily basis as either a business owner, that's who I'm talking to specifically, or the person that may handle these duties within the company. Having a podcast affords you the opportunity to be able to network with literally anybody that you want. For example, it takes the conversation offline to online. So you go to a networking luncheon or a meeting or a B&I meeting or a chamber meeting or a networking event, whatever the case may be, and you meet somebody. Let's call him Bob. And Bob is an ideal client for you, and you really want to meet with Bob. Bob's a busy guy, though, and he has a lot of you reaching out for similar things. Meetings, I want to sell you something, I want to pitch you something, yada, yada, yada. How do you differentiate yourself? Well, Bob, it's great to meet you. Thanks for giving me your contact information. Here's my card. Actually, before we schedule a time to meet or anything, or grab lunch or coffee, I'd like to get you on the podcast. I tell people stories, and I think you've got a very interesting story based on our conversation so far and what your company does. And with your experience, you're a perfect fit for the show. Can we make that happen? If it's okay with you, I'm going to email you a link that you can schedule a time that works best for you. You understand how non-abrasive that is and how it's not the norm of meeting somebody at a networking event or online or however you meet this individual and identifying them as a potential client and saying, well, can we schedule a call so I can sell you my widget? It's a completely different approach. So if you're thinking about starting a podcast, if you own a business, you should have a podcast because the number one networking tool and content tool that you will have for your business is a podcast. But I've lived this out for years upon years upon years, not even knowing what I was doing prior to going all in with podcasting back in 2016. I would just interview people to build a relationship with them. Later on, I would start interviewing people that wanted to start a podcast, not knowing they wanted to start a podcast until I interviewed them. And at the end of the conversation, like I ask everyone, so when are you starting a podcast? And that converts over to a significant amount of new business from my podcast guests. So if you're sitting here scratching your head, I want to start a podcast. I just don't know what kind of podcast I want to start for my business. Or what I hear a lot is, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I'd say, great. Do you currently prospect for new business? Yes. How do you gain new business? Through prospecting, maybe marketing, maybe advertising. Most people are generating new business through referrals and through networking. So with that being said, being able to network with your podcast and also be able to build relationships with your podcast, That's what leads to contributing to your bottom line and being able to take your podcast from, well, just a podcast, because there's a lot of them out there. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about how many podcasts are out there. Worry about the podcast you're creating and what your strategy is to be able to actually gain new business from that podcast. But more importantly, make sure your content game is in check, because both of them work together. So if you're leveraging your podcasts to meet new people, to network with new people, to interview them and convert them to new clients, maybe you're using your podcast to interview people that are in your existing pipeline in addition to new people you meet. That's a brilliant strategy. If you're doing that, not only are you contributing to being able to generate new business and build new relationships, but you're also recording podcast episodes that allow you to repurpose those podcast episodes where you're building relationships and prospecting and converting new clients. You're able to repurpose those episodes into micro content, blog posts, images, reels, clips, videos, whatever you want to do, which you should be doing anyway, which most people are not doing. So you want to make sure that when you set out to say, I'm going to start a podcast, you know exactly what your objectives are for starting that podcast. We're not just starting a podcast just to start a podcast. Again, there are a lot of podcasts out there. And if you are starting a podcast, well, because, so-and-so did it, or it seems to be the next best thing to go and do. Starting a podcast without a strategy is like jumping into a swimming pool with no water. You can do it, but it's highly, highly recommended against. Is that a word? Is that a phrase? It is now. It's not recommended. There we go. So making sure that you've got a strategy in place ensures that you'll know exactly what you're doing with the podcast, and it's also going to keep you in the game. Because if you start and you're just starting, well, we're just doing it just because podcasts and content, and, I'm a speaker, I'm going to write a book, and I'm an entrepreneur now. Everyone's an entrepreneur now. Everyone's a speaker now. Everyone's writing books now, yada, yada, yada. Separate you. And none of those things are bad, but you want to know why you're doing what you're doing. You want to separate yourself from the crowd, and you want to have a concrete strategy for what you're doing with your business. If you want to make money with your podcast, start interviewing people that you can do business with. I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who's a professional speaker, ex-NBA player, that had the opportunity to give a talk for his group this past Saturday. And he said, we're launching our podcast in a couple of weeks here. And I was curious if I should continue to leverage the podcast to do this, or should I leverage it to go and do this? Because what I've found is that when I go and speak, we're able to convert a lot of people that are in the audience over to clients. And I said, great. What if you did that same thing with your podcast? What if you did that same strategy with your podcast to gain more speaking engagements, where when you go to speak, you gain new clients? So the podcast allows you to identify new speaking opportunities because you're interviewing people that are hosting events. And then you're also interviewing people that you're meeting at these events that could potentially be a new client for you. And that's the magic of podcasting, is that you just never know what's going to be on the other side of that conversation. But if you set out from the beginning knowing that you want to start a podcast to build new relationships and to convert them into new business, it's going to be that just that much easier for you to really settle in to the podcast strategy, but more importantly, allow it to become sustainable, which that's what a lot of people struggle with, is the sustainability of having a podcast, because there's just excuses after excuses, and we started and then we stopped. How many times on a daily basis I hear we started our podcast, we recorded a few episodes, and it just never really got off the ground. So you gave up. Well, so you gave up. That's exactly what happened. When you have a strategy and a why behind what you're doing, I don't care what it is. Maybe in this case, it's a podcast. Then you're more likely to stick with it. And it only takes one deal after you've launched a podcast. You go, you know what? This works. This really works. And we're going to stick to it. And we're going to record 4 episodes a month. And we're going to integrate this into our outreach and our prospecting and our networking strategy to impact our bottom line, to impact our sales through our podcast. Oh, and by the way, when we're repurposing content from our podcast. We're posting it on social media every day, a couple of times a day on TikTok and LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook, stuff that you should have been doing for the past decade, but are just now starting to wake up to, well, maybe I should start posting on social media because that's where the eyeballs are at. It's where the eyeballs are at and will continue to be. That's where they've been for the past 20 years. You may just now be waking up to that reality. Listen, you arrive whenever you arrive to the world of the 21st century. But here we are. This stuff's not going anywhere. When you repurpose content from your podcast episode, guess what? You end up in the news stream. And in the news feeds, the news stream, I think I just called it, that when you're in the news feed and people are seeing your content, you're top of mind. You're marketing your podcast, you're marketing the podcast episode, you're marketing that podcast guest, you're marketing yourself, and you're marketing your brand. When you're top of mind and people start to think about what you do, guess who they call? You. But if you're not top of mind, they're calling your competitor. That's just the brass tacks of what it's all about. So that's just a quick dose of advice on how exactly to monetize a podcast. If you're looking to become the next Joe Rogan and looking to get thousands and thousands of sponsor dollars on a monthly basis, you got a lot of work to do. I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but most people will never get there. With that being said, what else do I do with my podcast? Leverage it to network, leverage it to build new relationships, leverage it to close new business, and leverage it to repurpose your content. That's one of the most popular talks that I give, how starting a podcast can solve all of your social media content problems. One podcast episode, multiple pieces of micro content allows you to stay consistent with your content game. When you're consistent with your content game, you consistently show up in the news feed. When you consistently show up in the news feed, people consistently think of you as top of mind. And when they need exactly what you do, guess what? They call you. So questions, thoughts, ideas, concerns about the world of podcasting or challenges you may be having. If you're watching this live, comment below. I respond to each and every one of you lovely people. If you're listening to the podcast episode, just shoot me a DM over on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram, and I'd be more than happy to reply back with you. Reply back to you. Sorry, adult braces problems over here. Got them tightened up a little bit yesterday, so it's a bit of an adjustment over here. Podcast thuck, everybody. So I hope that you learned a couple things here with this episode. We do this a couple times a week. I like to go live. Great. Another way of repurposing the content. I go live on 3 platforms at the same time. I then take the live recording, have my team produce it into a podcast episode, and then we take the archive from this live and we chop it up into micro content. So follow my lead. This is all golden advice. This is $1 million advice right now. You will radically change your life and your business if you take it, but more importantly, if you take action with it. Talk to you next time.